Pikachu, Sonic, Crash Bandicoot, Lara Croft. It's likely that a lot of your favorite characters came from the 90s, one of the biggest decades for gaming, and by far the most unhinged. Just look at this N64 ad, this one for the Game Boy. It gets worse somehow, but we'll get there, believe me. First, I have a lot of unanswered questions that I want to get to the bottom of. Why did characters look like that? What gave Nintendo 64 that unsettling, dreamlike feel? And what two games were so controversial that they created age ratings? You're in luck because we've done this a few times before, and the answers today are just as bizarre. So blow off your cartridges and sit back as we try to find out why. Talk about games and even begin to understand some of the coming topics, we first have to talk about how they were marketed, because things looked very different, and a lot of it would not fly today. If it's not clear why, it will be soon, but this doesn't mean that it wasn't awesome. Lots of electricity, fisheye lenses, and scenarios that made things appear a lot more exciting than they actually were. Many felt like being repeatedly punched in the face. The editing was aggressive and fast. Meaning you barely had time to question what was going on. Like, sure, this transition is cool, but why the fuck is the kid a lizard? Why is Ant-Man playing SimCity at a drive-in? Actual footage of the game in question was surprisingly rare, instead relying on bizarre and outlandish situations to sell you something. Another recurring theme was contests. There was always something to win, some competition to enter. Pokemon Snap advertised an Australian safari as the prize for taking the best photo of some in-game wildlife. Interesting, but I'm pretty sure you could get the win and the safari by just taking a camera to Woolworths. Others made a bit more sense. Custom gold controllers from Nintendo Power, the chance to be a Sega game tester, and so on. While these TV advertisements were quite out there, they were nothing compared to print ads. When people can just flick to the next page, it's even more important to have an eye-catching display. To deal with this, a lot of companies took things to the next level, and that's not an exaggeration. I cannot tell you how this passed through publication, or why it's written in blood, but it does get your attention. Whether it makes you want to buy whatever it's advertising though is another question. You'll notice that a lot of these work in a similar way. The actual product isn't really on display, just like how television ads rarely showed a lot of in-game footage. Instead, they draw you in using somewhat shocking imagery that compelled you to read the subtext to make sense of it all. This was a pretty effective way of introducing people to the real meat of the ad. When faced with a 2-page spread of a hot dog saying, "Be one," it's hard not to want additional context. The more insane the display, the more time you'd spend thinking about the game it was promoting. And that's a good thing, in theory at least. Because there's no way I'd want to buy a Game Boy after seeing this freaky ass ad. Nintendo was on one for a good few years and actually faced a lot of controversy for some of their campaigns. While most were relatively tame, albeit kind of depressing, the more provocative entries came under fire. One such ad showed a woman suggestively tied to a bed frame, a questionable premise for a handheld primarily marketed to children. I also like how some companies would just openly shit on their competitors, not in a subtle way. "Genesis does what Nintendo don't" is a crazy line. Sega's marketing war with Nintendo almost rivaled that of Pepsi and Coke. At this point, you might be wondering how any of these made it into production, and why video game marketing has since been flipped on its head. Broadly speaking, the culture around gaming was very different. They were still figuring out who exactly they were advertising to, which often led to campaigns that poked fun at their primary demographic. The typical gamer was painted as, well, kind of weird, edgy, horny, or a disturbing combination of both. It was clear that gaming still existed outside of the mainstream and was seen as its own cultural movement, a movement that appreciated this more edgy style of promotion. So, was this marketing effective?
Hell yeah!
Well, yeah, but mostly for a select group of people. Campaigns today try to appeal to a much wider audience by making things as neutral as possible. They no longer endorse the stereotypical gamer you saw in older advertising.
Here we have a normal, healthy young man. And here we have a fellow who's been experimenting with PlayStation.
Is this a good thing? It depends, but I do think this shift has left a lot of creativity on the table that we haven't seen for a long time. Ads like this definitely make games appear more exciting, and the tech more futuristic and advanced. It takes skill to make a Game Boy Pocket look cooler than an Xbox. Not really actually, but you know. Anyway, there was only one thing edgier than 90s marketing: the games themselves. We covered edging a little bit in the 2000s video, but the 90s was a whole other beast. After all, it's the reason the ESRB even exists. In fact, 2 games are credited as the sole cause. We'll revisit those because this edginess was shared by much more than just 2 franchises. Comparing the early Fallout titles to their modern counterparts nicely highlights this edgy phase. The first game takes itself a lot more seriously than 4 or 76. There's less humour and irony, making the atmosphere completely different. You are truly placed inside a bleak nuclear hellscape with no one but yourself to save you. The game's earthy colour palette, disturbing enemies, locations, and backstories contribute to an experience that feels more rooted in horror than any of its successors. Fallout 4, for instance, embraces the more playful aspects of 50s futurism. Other franchises don't need to be contrasted at all. Postal puts you in the mind of a mass murderer, driven by the belief that the Air Force is releasing a hate plague. Due to the subject matter, it was promptly banned or restricted in multiple countries, and when certain scenes were removed for Postal Redux, developers acknowledged that was simply because they were no longer shocking. Just in case there were any doubts about their rationale, turn over the game box and it gets even clearer. It has a distinct font and grungy aesthetic which we'll talk more about soon, but the key takeaway is the text. It boasts that no one else would dare to make this game, that it's psychotic, senseless, and antisocial. It feels like a deliberate middle finger to the growing concerns about video games and violence in the 90s. Naturally, its appeal comes from the fact that it does play into those narratives. It's the game every gamer wanted, purposefully controversial and incredibly edgy. Still, when it did release in 1997, it shipped with a big fat M for mature on the cover. Had it been released a few years beforehand, that might not have been the case. And here's why. You see, the ESRB, or Entertainment Software Rating Board, didn't actually exist until 1994. Most countries completely lacked a standardized classification system. This meant that many games could be bought and sold without age-related restrictions, and for a while that wasn't really a problem. In the 80s, there was only so much violence you could cram into a handful of pixels. Yes, there were outliers, but it was far from the norm. By the 90s, however, technology was catching up with people's imaginations. And, as you probably know, this can have fascinating results.
Say
I
uncle.
can.
Say uncle.
Uncle. What? Is this another Canadian thing?
Say uncle.
In the gaming world, more graphic titles like Mortal Kombat started to pop up. The gory nature of fatalities reignited criticisms from politicians, religious groups, and people with this haircut. More pressure was put on the industry to develop a consistent rating system, and Mortal Kombat was one of 2 notable titles in initial hearings. Which brings up something a little more unsettling, at least on the surface. Now, if you somehow haven't seen a video on this game before, I'll get you up to speed. 1992's Night Trap was less of a video game and more an interactive movie featuring real actors. As the player, you monitored several security cameras that just happened to be fixed on a group of teenage girls. The aim was to protect them from several vampire-like creatures that had infiltrated their sleepover. Sure, a weird premise, but how was this put in the same boat as Mortal Kombat? There was no nudity, explicit violence, or anything on par with tearing out someone's heart. Well, Night Trap's issues can kind of be boiled down to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The atmosphere around video games was incredibly tense, and when claims emerged that it promoted extreme violence against women, it stopped being seen as just a kinda creepy game, and became something far worse.
Walls never oozed blood, and kids weren't taught to rip off their heads or...
Like I said, you were actually tasked with protecting the group, and it was more campy than disturbing. The votes were in though, and in 1994, the industry responded with the ESRB. And here's where things get interesting, because the introduction of this system had a notable impact on the look and feel of 90s games. Being edgy suddenly had a legitimate place and a label in the industry. M. Games started to wear their controversy on the cover. Edginess was now a sanctioned genre, and it became the selling point for games like Grand Theft Auto and Doom. Towards the middle of the decade, box art started to look more like this, featuring distressed, graffiti-style fonts, grimy texturing, flames, and taglines boasting about their graphic nature. Aesthetically, games embraced grunge, which was already a popular design style at the time. I talked about this in my other 90s video, but it was especially apparent in this era of gaming. Fonts like X-Band Rough and gritty, distorted imagery were all hallmarks of the aesthetic. Look again at Postal, Half-Life, and any PS1 title. This wasn't just box art though. It seeped into every aspect of a game. Menus took on darker color palettes, levels featured dystopian urban landscapes, and the marketing was right there with them. While researching this video, I found a bizarre phenomenon surrounding the N64 that warranted its own section. If you've ever wandered through the jungles of Donkey Kong, explored the bottom of the well in Zelda, or stumbled through Gex, you might agree that sometimes things feel off. Many people talk about the N64 having a unique, dreamlike and unsettling feeling that is hard to put your finger on. I started to wonder what made these games so mysterious. Was it the chunky 3D graphics, aesthetics, or something else? And why did they look like that to begin with? First, let's talk about one of the creepiest locations I could remember to establish what this feeling even is. No matter how deep I dug, the bottom of the well from the Ocarina of Time would consistently appear in forums, and there's a good reason for that. Towards the middle of the game, you're given the option to drain the well at Kakariko Village. A dramatic animation plays as the water gradually disappears to reveal a cavernous entrance to the next dungeon. Unbeknownst to you, it hides one of the creepiest locations in the franchise, and a whole lot more. As you explore, you pass through tiny, claustrophobic tunnels, the walls coated with a sickly green hue. By now, you can't help but notice the soundtrack, a choir of voices cycling through uncanny melodies. Eventually, you reach a room and are immediately sealed inside by an iron door. Turning around, you find several arms protruding from the soil and quickly meet their owner, the Dead Hand. He's uniquely creepy, almost creepy in the same way as the eel in Mario 64 or the moon in Majora's Mask. But I can't help but think that none of them would feel as unsettling with modern graphics. There's definitely something about the N64 era of games that gives them this bizarre aura. Maybe it's the way textures stretch unnaturally over their jagged 3D meshes, or the surreal, nonsensical nature of their design. These qualities make it harder to connect environments and characters to real life, and consequently leave space for our minds to speculate and wander. So, when you're being guided by an eerie soundtrack or faced with an unfamiliar location, it's not surprising that things can quickly lean into the abstract, the absurd, and the disturbing. But what about games that aren't meant to be creepy? Why is this feeling shared across everything from Donkey Kong to Gex? Well, one possibility is the lack of clutter, which leads to a feeling of emptiness that is especially apparent when replaying them. We've become so used to environments being full, everything being placed with an express purpose, that when we revisit older games, the absence of detail stands out. Wide open levels, sparsely populated with low texture objects, do feel kind of dreamlike. Another big contributor is distance fog, which is something you don't see as much anymore. Plenty of N64 games used it as a technique to cover up their limited draw distance. An often unintended side effect was this weird, hazy atmosphere that made it feel like the world was fading away at the edges. Combined with the jagged textures and lack of clutter, I can easily see how many might attribute a weird feeling to N64 titles. But let me know what you reckon. Perhaps you've never experienced this. The 80s showed us that people love platformers. The 90s showed us that we did, but there was a limit. The success of characters like Sonic, Mario, and other 2D platformers inspired hundreds of other titles. They saw how a single iconic character could become the face of an entire company. It made marketing an absolute dream and let them appeal to a wide range of age groups. To try and capitalize on this, the decade saw a huge surge in mascot platformers. Everyone wanted to spawn the next Sonic, and many of their attempts were pretty bizarre. Earthworm Jim is the easiest example, following the story of a worm in a robotic suit. As an unlikely hero, it seemed equally unlikely that the game would ever really succeed. Surprisingly, it kind of did. In fact, it received positive feedback and multiple sequels. That being said, it was far from Mario's successor, and more of a sign that the well of mascot creativity was starting to run dry. Games like Boogerman made this even more apparent, despite being a reasonable jump into the world of pick and flick platformers. Either way, 2D mascot platformers started to flatline in the mid-90s, partially due to oversaturation, but mostly because 3D started to become the norm. Consoles like the PlayStation were made with it in mind, and it was no longer enough to simply make another walk to the right and jump game, regardless of who was jumping. This shift to 3 dimensions brought on a whole new set of problems though, both making and breaking several franchises. So let's talk about it. A well-polished game with 2D graphics is infinitely better than a rushed game in 3D. Right? Wrong. It's time to talk about the 3D arms race of the 90s and its consequences. And I don't just mean these consequences. We're going to investigate why cameras became the hardest boss in gaming, the winners and losers of 3D, and how a single game changed the entire industry. But first, we need to establish how we even got there, because 3D games weren't created in the 90s. Exploring more than 2 dimensions had technically been possible 20 years earlier.
Super Mario in real life.
1973's Maze War was a first-person shooter that pitted you against other online players. While it's credited as the first 3D game, the most impressive thing here was the fact that you could play it on an Apple product. Anyway, looking to the 80s, we saw things really start to take off. Battlezone featured another truly 3D environment, only this time being slightly more accessible through arcades. There's a whole lot more to cover in the 80s though, so subscribe if you've ever wondered what the hell was going on there. I might just have something on the way. The point is, 3D gaming was very rudimentary and limited for a long time. Neither the hardware nor the software behind it could handle anything beyond a few lines representing sprites and their environments. As you know, all of this dramatically changed in the 90s. Polygon-based graphics slowly became the norm, with everything made from a mesh of 2-dimensional surfaces. This caused the jagged, chunky look of games on the PS1 and N64. It also caused a new, incredibly irritating problem, one that you've definitely experienced. The thing is, for 2D games, the function of the camera was relatively simple. It followed the player moving left, right, and up and down on a flat plane. Naturally, this wasn't the case for 3D. Instead of just X and Y, there's also Z. This complicated things, and developers struggled to smoothly navigate depth. This often led to disorientating perspectives, glitches, and questionable game design. All of this was especially apparent in Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, and some of the areas in Donkey Kong 64. It made it a lot harder to judge how far a jump was, a pretty important feature in platformers. The boom of 3D games also meant that many 2D titles felt compelled to make the switch. And truthfully, not all of them were ready. Games like Castlevania 64 struggled to translate their side-scrolling perfection into this new format. It simply felt like a rushed attempt to keep up with the industry, rather than continuing to push the boundaries of their existing dimensions. On the other hand, many games did become bigger after transitioning. But it's hard to talk about those when I only need to mention one. This didn't just have the fancy new graphics, it had the controls to match. You could intuitively change camera angles with a joystick, freely roam around 3D environments, and experience a new level of fluidity while doing so. No longer were people held back by fixed camera angles. Now you could choose exactly where you were looking. Studios had allowed for similar features before, but it was never so refined. Here, 3 dimensions didn't feel gimmicky or rushed. It was a natural and well-executed evolution from their previous entries. To put things in perspective, on the other side of the board was Sonic, Sega's competitor to Mario. And in the world of 3D, they had started to lag behind. Sonic 3D Blast came out a few months after Mario 64, and the title was a stretch in more ways than one. It was neither true 3D nor a blast. Instead, it used an isometric, angled perspective to create the illusion. In some ways, this technique was not dissimilar to the use of full motion video in early Mortal Kombat games. Both were a way of simulating advanced visuals that weren't really there. The long and short of it is that Super Mario 64 didn't cut those kinds of corners. Although it wasn't the first 3D game, it was the first to do it so well. Whether you grew up in the 90s or first picked up a Game Boy in the 2000s, it's hard not to appreciate the aesthetic hallmarks of the decade. There's a certain charm to these early graphics, and I certainly prefer this grungy approach to marketing. While the edgy phase was easily on par with the 2000s and sometimes just as cringy, all of these games helped define one of the most memorable decades in gaming history.